Hello and welcome. This is Grunch, and I am doing my first gatecrash preview video. Going to be talking specifically about draft, not sealed, draft. A lot of people, in my opinion, conflate the two and just call it all limited. I don't like this. I think there are a lot of cards whose value is higher or lower in one of those formats or the other. Two categories of cards come to mind as being specifically different value in draft versus sealed. The first one is what I would describe as marginal creatures. Creatures who maybe aren't quite up to the power level of even, say, a good common or uncommon, but in sealed deck you kind of have to work with what you're given. So sometimes you play those 5-mana 3/3s and you kill somebody with Poison Belly Ogre. That's going to happen. But in draft, you have a lot more control and choice. So, Poison Belly Ogre? Sorry buddy, you're sitting on the bench. The second category of card that I would say specifically changes in value is situational spells. Cards that are awesome in some circumstances and may just do stone nothing in others. Which is a pretty good segue into talking about Act of Treason. Before I get too much into specifics about Act of Treason, let me talk about the way in which I like to analyze these cards. In particular, I'm not a fan of pick orders or a numerical value for a card. I think this is a little too advanced of an analysis for the pre-release, for the release, even for a couple weeks after the set is out. Secondly, I think a holistic approach is a little more useful. It's not enough to say, this card's bad, this card's good. That's kind of a crutch. Instead, what I think is more useful is to say, how can we use this card? Where does it fit into the existing archetypes? And how does it interact with some of the other more important cards in the format? So now, let's talk about Act of Treason. We've had Act of Treason at common and other limited formats, and a threaten effect is kind of one of Red's staples. So if you've played a fair amount of draft, you have kind of a baseline for appreciating this card. This format, I suspect, Act of Treason will actually be better than perhaps it's ever been before. And the reason for this is because when you steal their creature, you're adding a guy to your board to get you closer to that 3-creature count that triggers your battalion effects. So I think Act of Treason is going to be pretty good in Boros. As far as Gruul is concerned, it's a little bit worse, because you want to leave your mana open so that you can threaten a Blood Rush effect to make your opponent's blocks far more awkward. I still think Act of Treason is probably pretty good there, especially if your opponent just has one big blocker. It's going to be a huge chunk of damage. But it is probably best in Boros. This may seem obvious, but the point is, if you're seeing Act of Treason and you want to view that as a signal, it's a Boros signal. So now, moving on to our first actual new card of the set, Bomber Core. So what can we do with Bomber Core? Well, a 1/2 for 2 isn't the most aggressive creature. But this battalion trigger, where you can deal 1 damage to target creature or player, could potentially be very good. The set isn't completely full of X1 creatures, but there are some. And if you get multiple Bomber Cores triggering, it can be pretty tough for your opponent to stick anything that isn't a big creature on the table for very long. But maybe the most important part about Bomber Core is that it's cheap. And the Battalion Boros decks are gonna want cheap creatures. This guy is, again, not the best in Gruul. This is much more of a Boros card. But I like it. This isn't a high pick, but it's a solid pick. And you should be able to get it toward the mid-late part of the pack. That's my prediction. Next creature on the list, Burning Tree Emissary. This guy is kind of difficult to evaluate. The best case scenario, you're playing probably a Gruul deck, and you play him and then immediately play another 2-drop. Hilariously, if you have multiples of these guys, you can just empty your whole hand in one turn, and that'd be pretty funny. But overall, I think this is just going to be mostly a Grizzly Bear. Sometimes it'll be a free Grizzly Bear, But even then, it still ends up just being a grizzly bear. For an uncommon, kind of a letdown. Probably not a good signal, but who knows. You're going to want cheap creatures in decks like these. So, pick it up if it's free, but don't pick it up high. On to something much more exciting. Cinder Elemental. Now, Blaze is fantastic. 4-mana 2/2, not quite so fantastic. So sometimes your Blaze is going to get hit by their shock, and he's going to die. But sometimes you're going to be able to, say, bring this guy back from your graveyard. There are a couple cards in this set that do that. That's a pretty powerful effect, because X spells in Limited tend to be very powerful. If this guy could only hit creatures, he'd still be a very good card. But being able to just chunk your opponent for huge portions of their life total makes this guy very good. It's possible the format's a little too fast for him, but even then, he won't be excellent, but merely good. I like Cinder Elemental quite a bit. A card I'm much less a fan of is Crackling Perimeter. How many gates can you really get? Really? 3? 4? I suppose you might be able to build a deck around this if, say, you got 2 Crackling Perimeters, and then you just draft every gate you see and try to just dome your opponent out. Maybe. Possibly. It's always a mistake to try to underestimate a reach effect like this. Anything that can deal repeated damage to your opponent, as we've recently relearned with Lobber Crew, is potentially a pretty strong card. But this does nothing to the board. Does nothing to their creatures, doesn't make your creatures better, and requires you to draft cards that, while you might want some in-color ones, if you're drafting an Orzhov Gate to play in your Gruul deck to power up your Crackling Perimeter, you're working pretty hard to get 1 point of damage on your opponent. So overall, I'm not impressed. But I am willing to admit that I could be wrong. And sometimes you're going to lose to this card. But a lot of the time, I think this will be a skill tester. The next card coming up is Ember Beast. Now, if you've ever played with Mog Flunkies, you might have kind of a baseline for this guy. Adding a mana for a point of toughness, not the best deal. But this is still a fairly aggressively costed creature. Anything whose power and toughness add up to more than twice their mana cost could be considered what we would call a pushed creature. Speaking of push, Ember Beast needs somebody to kick him going. But that shouldn't be a problem, because you're going to want battalion triggers anyway. So you can almost kind of consider this guy a pseudo-battalion trigger, in that he's crap on his own, but if you're swarming, he's a beating. As far as Gruul's concerned, I think those decks are going to have a lot more single and double creature situations, but they'll still appreciate a nice Ember Beast. It's a big dude. It's going to beat down. A slightly less big dude, still a beatdown, is Fire Fist Striker. This creature is exactly what the aggressive Boros battalion decks are going to be looking for. You want to be rewarded in order to get your battalion triggers going, but you can't just mindlessly Alpha Strike every turn. However, if you can prevent their biggest, nastiest guy from getting in on the blocks, that goes a long way towards making your Alpha Strikes a better choice. Think this guy is going to be a relatively high pick in Boros? Solid in Gruul, though not quite as exciting. Up next, however, we have a much less exciting creature. Meh. Foundry Street Denizen? To get this guy to really be good, you're going to have a ton of small red creatures, cheap aggressive cards. Even then, you're working awfully hard for what really amounts to a Savannah Alliance. Not a fan of this guy, but sometimes you're going to need 1-drops. We'll see how the battalion decks play out, but I can't imagine Gruul decks wanting this card. A 1/1 for 1 just almost isn't worth a card, so you have to really be doing something with him. Could be wrong, but I think this card's pretty bad. Speaking of pretty bad, Frenzied Tilling is not a good way to fix your mana. Nor is it a good way to kill your opponent's lands. There's no bounce lands, no Karus to be killing with this. Killing a guild gate, while I suppose it could be good, could cut somebody off from a color, you're just not doing it fast enough. Sure, this card is technically a 2-for-1, and yes, it's mana fixing, so people will play it, and you, when you're suffering a little variance and can't quite cast everything, will then be put into a hole you'll never dig out of. Sometimes a stone rain can be a blowout, even at 5 mana. If you know me, you know I despise Moan Vonley Acid Moss. And Frenzied Tilling is almost an Acid Moss. But not quite. At 5, meh. Leave it in your sideboard, please. Not just for your own sake, but your opponent's. Let's play a fun game. Speaking of fun, I like it when red gets cards that refer to blocking. I think that's interesting. +3/+0 in First Strike is about as good as +3/+3, so we can consider this kind of a giant growth on defense. It's kind of also like a smite. Are you really going to want this, though? I don't think the aggressive Boros Battalion decks really want to be doing much blocking. Sometimes you're going to have to. Sometimes the other guy will have a faster Battalion deck. Sometimes they'll just keep kind of a slow hand. But these are situations that you're not trying to set up. So Furious Resistance is best in situations you don't want to be in. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's some kind of gruul control deck. Maybe. No, probably not. Really? This is just a defensive card in a color where the entire set wants you to be attacking. Blood Rush only works when you're attacking. Battalion only works when you're attacking. And nearly every red card in some way encourages you to turn everything sideways and just forget about being on defense. So something that only works on blockers? This is just not a card. But what is a card is Gore Clan Rampager. Blood Rush is a pretty interesting mechanic, so I'll probably talk about it right now. Whenever you're attacking and you're playing green and red, your opponent's going to have to go, does he have a Blood Rush guy? Which Blood Rush guy does he have? Depending on which one it is, the way they choose to block or not block as appropriate could very radically change the outcome of the game. This guy is one of the more pushed Blood Rush guys. 4/4 Trampler for 4 would be fine on its own. A spell that was a green and a red. Target attacking creature gets +4/+4 in trample. That's better than Colossal Might. Pretty good. Combined? Fantastic. I think this guy's a first pick. And I think he's a big blowout. Probably going to make it into Constructed. Because Trample is the single best thing when you put it on a giant growth. And an efficient guy, as a split side of that, oh yeah. Speaking of oh yeah, Ground Assault. Oh yeah. If you're drafting Gruul, you're going to want about as many of these as you can get. Early game, it'll probably be big enough to kill anything. And assuming you keep making your land drops, it still kills anything. No, really, it just kills stuff. Ignore the fact that it's number of lands you control, whatever. It just blasts a guy. And later on in the game, you're going to spend 2 mana to kill their 5 and 6 drops. This is, bar none, the best removal spell in green and red in the set, in my opinion. Gruul Charm is an interesting card. It's difficult to evaluate a charm because any individual mode is usually not quite worth about what you're paying for it. Although, when they are, they're very good. So, let's get into the modes. Creatures without flying can't block this turn. That's almost Falter. Falter is situational, but Falter, when it's good, usually just means the game is over, and you win. So this is definitely an effect that will come up, and one of the reasons to draft it. Gain control of all permanents you own. Don't think this is going to come up very often. I might be forgetting one card, but from the spoiler I think there are 2 ways in the entire set that your opponent can steal your creatures. Okay, 3. I forgot active treason. So if they active treason your guy, before they get to attack, you can Gruul Charm and say, yeah, no thanks, that's mine. It could be a pretty big blowout. If they were trying to set up a battalion trigger, get rid of your biggest blocker, okay, I'm sold. Second mode can happen. Gruul Charm deals 3 damage to each creature with flying. Now that's a good one. Flyers, generally speaking, are a little bit smaller than non-flying creatures. That's why they fly. Flyers that have more than 3 toughness, starting to push into the category of bombs. Not always, but they're at least very good. And hitting all of them at once, that's pretty incredible. Plummet was a completely playable card, often main deck worthy. And while getting 3 damage to all guys doesn't get some of the nastier rares out there, it'll get most of the common and uncommon guys. And sometimes your opponent's going to have mostly flyers, and mostly just lose. So I'll take me some Gruul Charm. Might even be worth splashing when you're not a pure Gruul deck. I think this is a really good card. Moving on, we have the Gruul Key Rune. Now if you've played a fair amount of Return to Ravnica, you probably have, again, some basis for comparison to the other key runes. The 2 questions you have to ask with the key runes are this. How important is it that I play my mid to late game spells quicker? So how top heavy is my curve? And how valuable is activating this guy? What do I get out of the creature mode from the key rune? The creature mode is a 3/2 red and green beast artifact creature with trample. Trample on a 3/2? That's not super exciting. 3/2 is about as big as 3/3, so this is pretty close to Selesnya key rune. That said, Selesnya had a lot of cards that were a little more top heavy and they kind of want to cast. Key runing out stuff like Courser's Accord, that was pretty good. This set doesn't quite have as much high end, but it is there. And in particular, some of the more beefy Gruul cards are kind of pushed. We'll see them in a later video. But my prediction is that Gruul Key Rune does end up actually being one of the better key runes. And it might delineate which type of Gruul deck you're playing. There might be some Gruul decks that are just fatty boom booms and then fatty boom booms. Try to skip the early turns as much as possible and get to some fatties. And there might be some where you're trying to curve out smoothly, threatening a Blood Rush guy on each attack step, and then dropping a creature each post-combat main phase. Gruul Key Rune is probably not as good in those, but it's still pretty solid. Play a bear, attack with your bear, then play Key Rune, attack again with your bear, play a beefy guy. Yeah, alright. But there is one last element to Gruul Key Rune. That being, it's going to be in the same decks as some Blood Rush cards. So that trample that I kind of gave a meh on before, I gotcha. I was tricking you. It's actually fantastic. Just like with Gore Clan Rampager. Trample on a Blood Rush guy, or on the target of a Blood Rush effect, is amazing. It pushes damage through, and it makes sure that you get full value out of your Blood Rush effect. So, the real evaluation that I want to give this Gruul Key Rune is fantastic. Best in the set. Calling it now. Not best in the set, but something you're still going to have to play against an unfortunate amount is Hellraiser Goblin. Let me first get this out of the way. This card in your Gruul deck, probably not where you want to put it. It'll go there sometimes, You'll play it, you'll do what it says on the card text, because red cards come with instructions because they get played by red players. So creatures you control have haste and attack each combat a fable. Well, it's a red creature. What was it doing? Come on. You're playing red. How did you not... Really? You need instructions? Anyway, in your gruul deck, this might get played, it might not get played. The point is, if you're tapping out for this early, you're not threatening a blood rush trigger, which makes your opponent's blocks just much more onboard, mathematical, obvious. They can solve it. So, in your gruul deck, I'd say avoid this. But your Boros deck is going to want this guy. Going to want this guy pretty much every time. Boros comes with instructions. And the instructions are: creature, creature, haste creature, trigger your battalion effects. 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop. Battalion triggers, get ya. There you go, red players. I did the math for you. Speaking of math, the math in this set is much better when the burn spells can't target players. It means that your reach effects are going to come from pump spells and dedicated reach effects, not on your removal spells. Burn spells that can do both are just so powerful. Granted, this can't hit your opponent, but it's still pretty powerful. 4 damage is going to kill most things. As an instant, it's going to kill most things when you want them dead. And killing each creature with the same name means that this card blows out tokens. There's not as many tokens in this set, by a mile, as there were in Return to Ravnica. But there's a couple. They're out there. And that means that this card is sometimes going to answer one of those. Yeah, take this card. Maybe not super high, but it is removal. You'll want it. Speaking of things you're going to want some skills. Some madcap skills. This is one of the more aggressive examples of the war paint / pursuit of flight / unholy strength effects that we continue to see. +3/+0 is pretty big, that's a beating, but can't be blocked except by 2 or more creatures. Means that when they do suck it up and trade with your guy, there's a pretty good chance you don't get 2 for 1. You go 2 for 2, which is totally fine. Yes, there are bounce spells. Yes, there are still removal spells that will hit your guy. Sometimes you'll get wrecked because you played an aura. But a good chunk of the time, you can just slap your madcap skills on whatever creature you got, go to town. Kind of frustrating just how pushed this card obviously is. But I guess they want auras to see play. If you're into this kind of thing, do it. But it doesn't help trigger Battalion. So just be aware of what you're trying to do and why you're playing this card. In that vein of knowing what you're trying to accomplish and how, we have a fairly complex card in Mark for Death. Target creature an opponent controls blocks this turn Fable. So that's lure. That means that you can force their, say, utility creature to block your big beatdown guy. Maybe their biggest guy blocks your little death touch guy. There's a lot of situations you can make this useful. Untap that creature, well, that just makes sure it works every time. Other creatures that player controls can't block this turn, however. Almost a falter. Like Gruul Charm, almost a falter. So in some situations, this is going to be a removal spell and a falter. Now they still get to pick which creature they block, so it's not quite a removal spell. And they do get a block, so it's not quite a falter. But I think there's a lot of room for a card to be not quite both of those things at the same time. Still be a pretty good card. I think I want to play with this one a little bit before I try to call it as very good or very bad, just because there is so much going on here. But I do expect this to see some play, swing some games, and be kind of fun. Much less fun, at least from my perspective, is Massive Raid. Just read it. You see what it does? Okay, sometimes this will be a removal spell. It's gonna happen. Yeah, you're not gonna be happy, but you killed their guy, so you're beaten down. But what I think is really gonna happen is these very creature-heavy Gruul and Boros decks will just sort of be like, oh, well, I had 7 guys on the board. I drew a Massive Raid. I guess you're dead. Sweet game, right, bro? See, burn spells that can hit players and do a lot of damage tend to just kind of end games. And that's kind of what I expect out of Massive Raid. Granted, you can't run an infinite number of spells in your Battalion and Blood Rush guy decks. And even if you could, they wouldn't be good with Massive Raid. But a couple of these in most decks that are red, it's going to be pretty good. Speaking of pretty good in your red decks, you have a surprisingly basic card in Mugging. Not being able to hit players with your shock sounds like it might be a drawback. It's really not. The fact that you can prevent their best creature from blocking for the turn means that when this is intended for reach, it probably actually does more damage than a shock could to begin with. Okay, it's a sorcery, which is a little bit worse. But really, cheap removal is basically always playable. I don't think this card's wowing anybody, but you're going to stick it in your decks. People will probably actually stick too many in some of their decks, because, again, Battalion, Blood Rush, you got to be pretty creature heavy to make these things work. And if you got too many Muggings, don't got enough guys to trigger your Battalion effects, you're not getting in very much, except for that guy that can't block this turn. So, pick it, obviously, but it's not a first pick. It's probably not even a third pick. It's probably not a very good signal until midway through the pack. Speaking of signals, Pit Fight's going to make for a really tough one to figure out. Because it's hybrid mana, it can go in 3 of the guilds in this set. 60% of all the decks in the format, not counting decks that reach into 4th and 5th colors, could potentially play Pit Fight. Now, while it is technically a card you could play in your Boros decks, I think Boros is going to be mostly full of small-ish creatures that don't actually want to fight some of the other guys that are out there. It'll still happen, you'll still play it, but it's just awkward for a removal spell. In your Gruul decks, well, you're going to have some more beefy guys, and you're going to want to fight. It's perfect flavor. But, where I think this card might shine surprisingly bright is in those Simic decks where you're evolving a guy. I'll have a draft video for that in a little while. But let's just say, I think the Simic decks might have the biggest guys. Even bigger than your big Gruul beaters, assuming everything goes right. And the Simic decks, being both blue and green, are going to be kind of hurting for removal. So while Pit Fight looks like a Gruul card, I think it's almost a Simic card. But in any event, it's an instant speed prey upon, which means it's both removal and green and awesome. Awesome, though, is not what I would use to describe Primal Visitation. +3/+3 in haste on a guy for 5 mana. Haste is almost a throwaway here because unless we're talking about a 1-drop when you hit 6 mana, the haste probably doesn't matter, which means it's basically just +3/+3. Okay, that can do some stuff, but at 5 mana, you wouldn't want a 3/3 creature. So, do you really want to attach 3/3 to a guy you already have on the board? Again, auras come with a lot of risk. Madcap Skills gives you probably about this much value for 2/5 of the mana cost. I think Primal Visitation is one of those cards that people are going to play, but it's not going to be very good for them. I'd avoid. Ripscale Predator is also something hard to avoid. It's kind of one of those red big dumb idiots we keep seeing in every set. Tenement Crasher and so on. It's just the big red guy that for the past few years has just been a staple of every set. The text on him isn't particularly amazing because chump blocking isn't really the best strategy. It races sometimes, but you don't want to have to do that most of the time. So instead, they're going to have to trade. But a 6/5 creature almost always demands a 2-for-1 to begin with. So you're not really getting much value there. That said, this is still a big guy, and big guys kill people, so we gotta respect it. But at 6 mana, it's probably not a Boros card. And gruul decks have better choices for fatties. So I think this guy's pretty marginal. Speaking of better choices for fatties, here's one of my favorite for the set. Ruination Worm. It's just a vanilla 7/6 for 6 mana. But 7/6 is a beast. This guy is huge. Just huge. And he puts the previous creature to shame because if they're not putting 2 guys in front of it, they're not killing it to begin with. They're just chump blocking, and if they're down to chump blocking, well, if they're not killing you with some evasion creature in the next couple of turns, you're winning it anyways. So I guess the real question is, would you show her your Ruination Worm? The next card is the Scorchwalker. One of the more front-heavy, more power-oriented Blood Rush guys. This is one of those effects where I mentioned trample being so pivotal. A lot of the time that 5th, even 4th, sometimes even 3rd point of power is going to be wasted. As an actual creature on the board, he's extremely flimsy. He hits hard, he hurts, but stick anything in front of him. No, literally, just anything. He'll die to a cold breeze. I'm not super impressed by this guy, but Blood Rush makes him a split card. And the other half of the split card is red, 1, target attacking creature gets +5/+1 until end of turn. 5 is a good chunk of damage. So my expectation is this guy will be used most of the time for the Blood Rush half of his effect. And since he's not really a very good blocker and not a terribly beefy guy in the first place, my expectation is that he'll be used mostly in Boros decks. Blood Rush, my guy. Pretty cool. There's even a little bit of double strike going on in the set to be found out there. And if you +5 power your double strike guy, well, that's a hurt. That hurts. So Scorchwalker's going to see some play. But as far as picking it, hope you wheel it. Hope you're really not picking it early. I like big butts and I cannot lie. You other brothers can't deny. When a chick walks in with an itty-bitty waist and a round thing in your face, you get sprung. No, seriously, sprung. 5/4 for 5. Alright. On the power curve, that's fine right there. And Blood Rush this guy? That's a beating. At common, this card is quite impressive. And those gruul fatties I keep referencing, this guy is your pork chops. This guy's your bacon. You can get as much of him as you can, as often as you can. So one of the things you might have noticed is I keep bringing up Trample, because of how awesome Trample interacts with Blood Rush. Well, Green-Red Guildmage is Trample on tap. That's a little expensive to both Trample and Blood Rush, but it'll happen. Most of the Blood Rush costs are 3, roughly. So, mid-game, spend 5 and make sure you get full value out of your Zerta Swine that's Blood Rushing your Scar Guildmage that's trampling over whatever stupid guy they tried to block with. And if you're out of gas, just make some lands 4/4s. 8 mana to make 2 4/4s, it's pretty strong. And if people have to start trading with your lands, they're gonna be unhappy. Especially because 4/4 is big enough that it might take 2 of most average creatures. So, Scar Guildmage, while not outstanding in the early game, continues to allow you to apply pressure throughout the remainder of the game, and will probably be one of the better creatures in your gruul deck. Next card in line is the best Goblin Piker ever printed. Okay, probably not the actual best Goblin Piker ever printed. But he is a Goblin. He is a 2/1 for 2, which makes him a Piker. But a Piker with a secondary mode. Blood Rush, and give a guy +2/+1. That's going to ambush some people. And because it only costs 1 mana, it's going to be relatively easy to sneak in there in the early game while still using your rest of your mana to do other stuff. So this makes this guy an early drop that's still a useful top deck later on in the game. Pretty much exactly what every aggressive red deck wants. So, put him in your Boros deck, put him in your gruul deck. You're going to want 2 drops. Here you go. So Lava Spike, as an instant. And players can't gain life. Look, as far as limited goes, you have to be extremely aggressive to want this effect. Which means most of the time you're probably sideboarding it in against somebody who is also sideboarding in, or just has in general, a bunch of life gain. It's pretty narrow. What I really want to talk about is this card for Constructed. And in particular, the bias this card brings out of people. In that if you ask somebody who is a red player, self-described red player, if Skullcrack is a good card, if that's something that they should have, well, yeah, people gain life? What? They shouldn't be able to just gain life. That's... Come on, I'm trying to burn them. But really, in terms of game balance, one of the first things anyone playing any competitive strategy game learns to do is to just go all-out offense. And the next thing they usually learn how to do is how to stop that all-out offense. When they make cards like Skullcrack, they make that basic, that level 1 strategy, just kill you as soon as I can, so good that it can trump more advanced and more interesting, honestly, strategies. I don't like Skullcrack. I don't like what it says about design. I don't like that it exists. Mostly because I want to play Sphinx's Revelation, but regardless. Don't play this card. This Structural Collapse. Just don't play it. Okay, it's 6 mana. Doesn't kill creatures. Doesn't make a creature of your own. Isn't terribly likely to kill your opponent. Yeah, okay. So if they have a key rune and they're short on lands, you get to scum them and get kind of a 2-for-1, and they don't really get to play Magic, but these magical Christmas land scenarios are so bad. And you're playing to win more in games that you're already winning, and your opponent is already not happy to begin with, but he might get to play Magic the Gathering if something like this doesn't happen to him. And since it costs 6 mana to begin with, Frenzied Tilling into this just makes you a scumbag. I'm sorry, but scumbag. Just LDing scumbag. Just such a scumbag. On the other hand, looting effects are pretty good. This one is 6 mana and requires you to discard on the front end. So it's awkward. But, being not a small, flimsy creature, it's unlikely to die. So, while the red decks probably don't want this kind of card for most of the games, I could see this as a sideboard element against, say, a very, very controlling Orzhov or Dimir player. Where, if you just never get mana flooded, you're probably going to win the game at some point. Might take a while, but you'll win. But as far as main deck goes, just don't see it. So earlier, I was discussing how sometimes we get these big red idiots Well, here's kind of a big red idiot. This guy has pretty marginal stats. His ability is very meh. Very, very just, yeah, I guess. Boros decks probably can do better than this if they really want a 5-drop. Gruul decks can certainly do better than this, but sometimes you're not that flush with options. You're going to have to play a marginal guy. Here's your big red idiot. So one of the more interesting things about Blood Rush is that the way the cards are structured, they essentially slap whatever creature the base Blood Rush spell is onto the attacking guy you're putting it on. Now, a 3/1 First Striker for 4 is not exciting, but not terrible. It's fine. But the ability to give First Strike to an attacking creature, that's a little bit better. So as a trick, this guy's probably better than he is as a body, but he's kind of fine as both. And since you get the option, it's probably pretty good. Not sure whether this guy goes more in Gruul or more in Boros, but he's probably just a pretty good guy in either one. So the final card for my Red and Gruul preview video, Warmind Infantry. This is exactly the kind of card that's going to want to go in those Boros Battalion decks. Because the body is, I mean, Hurloon Minotaur has been sort of about where they've been willing to put a lot of creatures anymore. That 2/3 for 3 kind of gets tossed around pretty casually. But when he's a 4/3 for 3, that's pretty aggressively accosted. And honestly, kind of hurts. And that's Order of the Sacred Bell, which cost 4 and was green, not 3 and red. So, while not a high pick, I think your Boros decks are going to end up playing this guy. And I think these are the kind of battalion triggers that make it worth it to set up battalion. So that's it for the Gruul and Red video.